we are using the Zoom platform. That's by far the most commonly used teleconferencing platform in the world, and you're probably very familiar with all the controls and commands. So I won't talk about that for a long time, but I will tell you something about the structure of this event. Today you will have the opportunity to hear 4 presentations from 4 people, as I said, from Ms. Alex Mackey, from Mairi Dupar, from Boris Orlovsky, and from Oliver Gardi. Those will be 15-minute presentations, and after that you will have half an hour to ask questions or to make comments. And you can ask the questions and make the comments in the following manner. There is a chat button on the left side of the bottom control panel, which is approximately here somewhere. And you can click on the chat button and you can ask your question or make your comment either in English or in French. And after our speakers have done with the presentations, they will address all your questions and comments. And just as a kind reminder to all the presenters that I will be sharing their presentations, and all they have to do is tell me when to move to the following slide. So I wish you to have a nice and successful and fruitful event. And without any further ado, I pass the floor to Ms. Mackey, who is our chairperson. So Ms. Mackey, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think that we can maybe wait just a couple more minutes here to see if we have anyone else who wants to log in. I know it is a kind of a lunchtime event, so we'll see if anyone else joins us today. But in the meantime, it would be wonderful if everyone could go ahead and put into the chat where they're joining us from. I'm coming from Geneva, Switzerland, with Zoe Environment Network. So yeah, go ahead and feel free to share that with us today, just so we can see about our audience. And then I'll give it maybe a couple of more minutes and then continue. All right, wonderful. Well, I'll go ahead. We do have a few last minute people joining now, but good afternoon to everybody and welcome to this webinar, which is called Climate Projections for Project Design. So my name is Alex Mackey and I'm currently a project manager at Zoe Environment Network here in Geneva, Switzerland. We are also a member of the Swiss NGO DRR Platform, and the mission from Zoe Environment Network is to make environmental information more accessible and better communicated to the general public, to decision makers, and to implementers of different projects, environmental projects around the world. So as a few housekeeping notes for everybody, we are going to have 4 speakers today, as was mentioned. If you do have any questions, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the event. After the 4th speaker. So go ahead and at any point you may share your question in the chat. Go ahead and just ask it. If it's directed to someone specifically, you can mention that there as well. But we'll go ahead and take questions at the end. So additionally, as was mentioned, but just for the latecomers, the newcomers, interpretation into French is available. So feel free to select the globe and select French if you would prefer to listen to it simultaneously translated into French. So that being said, we'll get back to the content. So the webinar was organized here by the Swiss NGO DRR Platform. And what we're trying to do is give an overview on how to find sources for climate projections and how to use this information for climate proofing and the different projects that are worked on. So we're hoping that can also kick off a really nice discussion where our guests here and our speakers today can show some good examples of using climate projections in their projects, but also talk about some of the challenges that are associated with it. And also take an opportunity to discuss what the platform can do to provide more support in the future. So for those who just joined, you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. And if we could go ahead and share the first PowerPoint, please. I'll go ahead and get started. All right, so we can leave it here for a moment, but this webinar, one of the main purposes of it is to launch the new fact sheet that was developed by Zoe Environment Network along with the members of the Swiss NGO DRR Platform. It was actually created by my former colleague, Nina Salisma, who has now left Zoe. So I'm doing an effort just to present some of the work that was developed by her along with some of the other members of the platform. So we can start off by discussing what climate projections are. Next slide, please. Oh, and here's just a quick recap of our agenda again. So I will be launching the fact sheet and then we'll be hearing from 3 other speakers today too. Next slide, please. Yep, and the next one. So what are climate projections? Essentially, these are considered plausible simulated responses of the climate system. So these are different from weather forecasts, which are done much more in the short term, but essentially take place across different timescales that are much longer, normally something between 10 and 100 years. So that can vary, and it shows off kind of what the anticipated climate is going to look like over that period. So they do come from global and regional climate models and different scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions, and will create projections that happen from different scales. Normally, analysts will process data that takes place under different climate parameters, such as temperature, humidity, wind speed, and other relevant parameters from different climate models, and then they can develop what climate projections come out of that for different locations. So this also accounts for different driving forces behind greenhouse gas emissions. So essentially, what the IPCC will do is develop these based on different assumptions, such as socioeconomic factors, energy use, and the relationship between these two. So basically, they will make what could be best case scenarios, so which is take place if extensive action to reduce emissions takes place. But this could also range to worst case scenarios if no action takes place. So what these do is provide information on what are probable future climates and give estimates of the impacts of climate change onto different sectors. Next slide, please. So here's a graph of the IPCC emission scenarios from the 6th assessment report. Basically, the IPCC has used 5 different emission scenarios to project the climate response to greenhouse gas reductions, land use, and air pollutant features. So we're trying to showcase here. In the red, you can see this is the very high greenhouse gas emission scenario, which is when emissions have actually doubled from now until 2050, all the way down to the purple, which is showcasing the very low possibility if we do hit that net zero by 2050. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? Basically, as we all know, the future conditions of the climate are going to affect sustainability for development and humanitarian projects that many of us here work on. So what we're trying to do is encourage project implementers to incorporate climate projections into their planning, so that way we can increase climate resilience and also strengthen the adaptive capacity accordingly. So even for projects that are already underway, it would be potentially a very good idea to look at the taking an adaptive management style for improving and taking into account the different changes in our climate. Next slide, please. So what we've done here in the climate projections fact sheet is to develop the key steps that should be included into projects. So I'll just going to walk you through the different steps here. Number one would be to assess the current climate risk. So looking at the project using hazard vulnerability capacity assessment or a similar tool. In the fact sheet itself, which is now available online, there are listed some different risk assessment tools that can be used that are at your disposal and are perfectly public, so that way you can use them if you want to work on this step. Number two is to define the relevant time horizon for the decisions that are being made today within the scope and the focus of the project. So of course, as we know, climate projections could could examine between 10 and 100 different years. So of course, the projects that you're working on might have different time horizons there that need to be looked at. So considering how long you need to look at for the sustainability of your project is of course very important. Next slide, please. Number three is to determine the relevant climate information for the project based on the climate risk and time horizon. For different types of projects, this could be a little bit different. There are, of course, many different parameters that can be looked at. And so it's important to always consider which information is the most relevant to what you're working in. Number four is to assess the future climate risk by accessing information from available climate projections. And it's also important to remember to acknowledge the uncertainty and identify the sources of uncertainty that influence the climate projections in this time horizon. Next slide, please. Number five is to interpret information. So this can be to consider how trends in temperature, precipitation, and impacts in different sectors could affect communities, livelihoods, the environment, infrastructure, and services in the project area or project activities overall. Six is to identify and prioritize actions and integrate information into project plans by developing actions that increase resilience, reduce vulnerability of local communities to longer-term climate trends, and support adaptation to current and future climate conditions. And number seven, of course, which is something that is always promoted under the platform, is to collaborate and share. Sometimes the climate projection assessments that are done for one project or in one region are of course relevant to other projects as well that might take place there or might be looking at similar parameters. So it's always important to look at how we can collaborate further to incorporate climate projections. Next slide, please. So finally, how can this actually be done in practice? So looking at available sources that are relevant to the project and the region. So an example of this is when you're working on an agricultural project, for example, looking at the projections of increasing temperatures or changing rain patterns, of course, help to inform on the future water availability and the suitability of certain crops that can be planted there. So this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. Second, which was already kind of referenced during the steps, is to acknowledge uncertainty. So climate projections are based on many different factors, such as greenhouse gas emissions, but also natural climate variability. So there is uncertainty that is a part of this. It's better to maybe look at some of the ranges of the factors like temperature and precipitation, so you get a better idea of it to help guide decision-making, but recognize at the same time that this may not be an exact science. So essentially just taking into account that uncertainty exists, but we're trying to do our best. And finally, and this is something very interesting for Zoe Environment Network, is that maps can provide really good overviews of climate projections. So they do show climate projection information, but it's in a way that's perhaps a bit easier to communicate to different groups of people. So these two maps were developed by Zoe Environment Network to showcase different climate projections, climate impacts in Central Asian countries. And as you can see, perhaps depending on who your audience is and who you're talking to, it might be a bit easier just to showcase what these will look like and also how it affects an entire region or an entire country and not just one small area. Next slide, please. So finally, one of the key elements of the fact sheet is that it does showcase some of the major sources of finding this relevant information. So we have the Climate Change Knowledge Portal of the World Bank, various IPCC assessments. So these could include the overall annual reports, but also there are a lot of regional chapters or cross-chapter papers that focus on different sub-themes, as well as regional and cross-cutting fact sheets. And so all of these different sources can be a little bit more specific to the projects that you're working on, and really talk about what the projections are for that region. They also do have an interactive atlas online, which could also be a very helpful tool. There's also the Climate and Development Knowledge Network fact sheets for Africa. And we do actually have a representative of the CDKN who will be speaking later to share a little bit more too. But there are also many national sources. So if you're working in country offices, there could be some national adaptation plans or other publications that are going to kind of already show these projections. And you can really take advantage of the work that's already been done to help to guide your project development. So this is just a general introduction to climate projections and to the fact sheet. If you'd like to see more, you can find it on the Swiss NGO DRR platform website. And also was attached to the event page for this event. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our next speaker, which is Marie Dupart, who is a senior technical advisor for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. And she is here to share with us today about applying IPCC knowledge for regional explainers on climate change. So Marie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alex, and congratulations on the launch of your fact sheet. That's really exciting. Hi, everyone. As Alex said, I'm Marie, and I work as a senior technical advisor for CDKN, which is actually an alliance of organisations. It includes my own ODI in London, UK, and also the headquarters at South North in South Africa, the regional Latin American office in Fundación Futuro Latinoamericano in Quito, Ecuador, and the Asia office in ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability in South Asia. So what I'm going to talk about is our experience in producing more accessible climate change information based on the IPCC's work. And our experience is particularly from Latin America and the Caribbean, South and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So I say that as a sort of context for the presentation today. Are my slides being shown? Actually, I don't see them at the moment, but that's lovely, thanks. If we could go to the second slide, please, about today's session. Thank you very much. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about why tailored regional presentations of IPCC findings are useful. And if you want to do more of this yourself, or just know how we did it, a bit about how to compile regional findings based on lessons from CDKN, and then some words about what's changed in the IPCC's communications and suggestions for working with them. Next slide, please. So why do a tailored presentation of IPCC findings by geography or indeed by sector? Well, as Alex outlined earlier, there really is a strong need for climate information to be made more available, more accessible for project planning. And also, let's be honest, for public awareness purposes, because the general public needs to be more aware of how the climate's changing and how it's going to change, to support and motivate them for behaviour change, for their own initiatives, and also to give political support for low carbon and climate resilience policies. Now, the principles of good communication strategy, which we'll get into in a minute, also suggest that tailoring information for your audience and for their context is indeed good practice. And why translate the IPCC's findings in particular? Well, I think the answer here is that the IPCC is probably the most authoritative scientific review process you'll find anywhere in the world. And You probably know this already, but there are 3 working groups of climate change scientists who convene under the IPCC. The working group 1 looks at the physical science of climate change. Working group 2 looks at impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability to climate change. And working group 3 looks at the mitigation of climate change. And if you look for the AR6, forgive the jargon, that's the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, which has just been published. Just on the physical science component alone, there were 234 authors from 66 countries, and those were composed of 31 coordinating authors, 167 lead authors, and 36 review editors, plus another 517 contributing authors. They made 14,000 cited references in their reports, and they took on board a total of 78,007 expert and government review comments, every single one of which they had to respond to. So that's really just an insight into how much work goes into these IPCC assessments, and indeed how authoritative they are. And just to further sort of describe what I'm talking about here and the work that CDKN has done, I want to emphasize something which Alex also mentioned, which is in this IPCC work, which we have turned into different types of communication product, is really talking about climate changes over the scale of decades. Right, so observed changes and future projections over the course of 10 to 100 years, as opposed to, you know, daily or weekly or seasonal forecasts. Next slide, please. So to say a little bit about CDKN's journey with doing tailored communication products around IPCC assessments, or as we call them, our summary explainers. We began experimenting with this in 2012, when the IPCC was putting out a special report, which was abbreviated to the name SREX. And this stood for a much longer title, which was Managing the Risks of Extreme Events and Disasters to Advance Climate Change Adaptation. So it was really the first time that the IPCC had done a special report on extreme climate and weather events. And we had a lot of anecdotal demand at the time from people in our network who were saying, as they saw this SREX draft heading towards governmental approval and publication, oh, this is hundreds of pages of very dense text. And how are we meant to figure out the portions of it which are most applicable to us? And we were hearing this from people, particularly at the time in the health sector, actually, who knew that there were a lot of health-related messages, but they were sort of buried deep down in the chapters. We were also hearing it from our colleagues in different geographical regions. And when you looked at the SREX summary for policymakers, it was very much a global summary, a very high-level overview, and it wasn't necessarily giving you the richness of the information for particular economic sectors or regional geographies that were buried in those hundreds of pages of a denser narrative report. So basically, we heard this call for help. How do we find what's relevant to us? And we said, okay, we'll give it a go. We'll try pulling out the sector specific and the regionally specific information from the chapters and producing those as very slim summaries. And we ended up, and you can still find these, in fact, on the CDKN website, even though they're becoming, as you can see, more than 10 years old now. We did sectoral summaries for health, water and agriculture sectors, and also for the ecological conservation sector. And we did regional summaries for Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean, which we got also translated into relevant languages like Chinese, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. Next slide, please. So just taking a step back now for a minute about what was our philosophy or our communication strategy behind trying to do this and what we hoped to achieve. Well, good practice in communications strategy and campaigning is about knowing your audience. Who are you speaking to? Trying to put yourself in their shoes, or understand what type of information they would consider most relevant. Then, of course, devising your messages or your communications content, testing it out a bit, refining it if necessary, and then delivering the communications campaign. And of course, creating opportunities for people to tell their stories and exchange and discuss on different platforms, so that you don't just have a kind of one-way broadcast of information, but you really are having a conversation with people. So that's where we were coming from. That's what we knew was good communication strategy. And now I'm going to tell you how it actually worked in practice for this particular campaign. Next slide, please. I should also say, actually, as a kind of an extension, that the context in 2012 was there was so much explosion of information and communications technology, which was providing this kind of democratization of online media into this fantastic opportunity for a big conversation, and much of that engagement being instantaneous and very decentralized and inclusive for those people who had a good internet connection. Of course, there was a digital divide, as there still is today. Not everyone has a good internet connection. At that time, there was also so much misinformation about climate change around. And I remember when we were devising the materials, there was at that time, it was more maybe in North America than in South America, a very sophisticated television advertising campaign underway called Carbon Dioxide is Good, basically. And it was funded by fossil fuel industries. And it had footage of happy families running through wildflower meadows with romantic music playing in the background, and a voiceover narrative saying carbon dioxide helps the plants grow, it helps the flowers to grow. You know, we're all better off in a world with carbon dioxide, aren't we? So this is kind of the context where we kicked this off, and we thought, what we must do, it's incumbent upon us to create materials based on the best scientific consensus of what is really happening with climate change and the role that human activity has in driving increased greenhouse gas emissions. So I also wanted to mention that as part of the context. And so, as I've said in this last bullet, we wanted to make it easier for people to counter misinformation about climate change and make it easy for people to share it, so that we'd create really attractive, accurate, you know, scientifically accurate materials that would be almost compulsively shareable. Next slide, please. What we know about science communications, and we did know back then, and it was particularly true of the IPCC's communications more than 10 years ago, is that lay people cannot easily understand the IPCC's key messages necessarily, including in the summary for policymakers documents, which they always derive from the underlying scientific reports. So there's always a need to sort of translate some of the wording into everyday language, but more than this, to contextualize it so that it's relevant to people's lives and work. And I give here an example. This is actually from the Physical Science of Climate Change report that was published at the end of 2021. So this is a more recent example than the SREX example I was discussing. And it says A4. So this is already elevated to a kind of a subheading within the summary for policymakers. It says, improved knowledge of climate processes paleoclimate evidence and the response of the climate to increasing radiative forcing gives a best estimate of equilibrium climate sensitivity of 3 degrees Celsius with a narrower range compared to AR5. Now, for most people, they don't know what paleoclimate is, even if they're a native English speaker like me. They don't know what radiative forcing is. They don't know what equilibrium climate sensitivity is. They may not know what narrower range is in this context. And they might not know what AR5 is. So to have that as a headline in your policymaker summary, even for very intelligent, committed, switched on policymakers, that's going to be quite challenging. And I picked this as an example for a couple of reasons. First is maybe a bit representative of the bridging that needs to happen between scientific language and policy language, which can then be applied. It shows you, it's an illustrative example of how the knowledge translators or the communicators have to break things down for the audience. In order to understand this statement, even though I've been personally involved in doing IPCC explainers for 10 years now, I had to look up the separate IPCC glossary online to figure out what actually equilibrium climate sensitivity was. It has to do with if you double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, how much does the temperature increase? But that was nowhere explained in the summary for policymakers. So anyway, just to make the point that as communicators, we need to provide the explanation, but also this is an example of a statement which is, it has ended up in the summary for policymakers, but it's actually a rather academic statement, and you probably don't really care about this unless you're a climate scientist. So if you were to put yourself in the shoes of policymakers or project managers planning a climate smart development project or the everyday public, what they really want to know is, how much has the Earth warmed until now? How bad could it get? When? And what can I do about it? And actually, statement A4 isn't really relevant to any of those things, particularly without that broader context. So as a climate communicator, I would just put it politely to the side and move on and select content in the IPCC's report that was a bit more relevant to people's lives. Next slide, please. So what happened with our 2012 road test when we did those geographic and sectoral explainers from the IPCC report about climate extremes and disasters? Well, we found that it's possible to simplify messages and tailor them to those regional and sectoral audiences, while at the same time not compromising on scientific integrity. And a key point I want to make here, and I'll come back to it later, is we had IPCC authors on the team with the science writers and communication strategists all working together. So they were continuously checking our work and making sure that we didn't go off-piste and accidentally mischaracterize something really important in the underlying scientific finding. We also found that visualizations rock. They can really work, like this one, which we came up with by ourselves. So this is basically showing trends in high temperatures, in low temperatures, in minimum temperatures, trends in heat waves, that is kind of longevity of high temperatures, in heavy precipitation, and in dryness and drought, and whether those are becoming more frequent and intense, or the science shows that it's ambiguous, there's not a clear signal. And the color coding is showing whether there's low scientific confidence, medium confidence, or high confidence. And we basically came up with these icons, these signs, and these tables to show what the different trends were for different subregions and different climatic variables, based on what was in the report, but we visualized it. And this gave people a sense of what the trends were at a glance. And it was very, very successful. But, and here's the next lesson. Next slide, please. we also learned from the road test that some visualizations unfortunately do not rock. So this was an example of a diagram that had come from the IPCC itself, and we'd basically reproduced it in our explainer guides. What it is trying to show is that it is showing, but it's difficult to understand at a glance, is that if you look at the last 20 years of the 20th century, so 1980 to 2000, and you take the frequency with which the hottest day happens as a 1 in 20 year event then, and you look under different climate warming scenarios towards the middle and the end of the 21st century. So what would have been a 1 in 20 year, hottest day in the 1980 to 2000 period? How often is that going to be happening by the middle of this century? Is it going to be happening 1 in 10 years, 1 in 5 years, 1 in every 2 years? And again, by the end of the 21st century, how often is it going to happen? I tried rolling out this diagram in a training for a room full of 20 Nepali journalists in Kathmandu. And unfortunately, the training morning went to pot because they found the depiction of this information just difficult to comprehend. And we ended up having to pick it apart and spend so much time on it that we then struggled to fit in the rest of the training. And that, for me, was a sort of bitter lesson in how sometimes you have to have a really deep think about whether a visualization is effective in conveying climate information. And even if for a scientific audience, it works really well and they're used to interpreting that, it just may not work at all well for a more general audience. And the media are particularly important because, of course, they are the gateway to the general public. So that's an instance where we should have followed our own communication strategy advice, and we should have tried that on focus group audiences before we rolled out the whole campaign, but we didn't. We learned the hard way. And then when we came to do future regional explainers in the coming years, we decided not to use these types of visualizations at all, which are called the return period graphs. So next slide, please. So implications of what we did in 2012 for how we made and disseminated IPCC explainers, what worked well, involving both experienced communications experts and IPCC authors together worked really well. And here, when I talk about communications experts, I mean a mix of capabilities from strategists through to science writers through to graphic designers. Sometimes one person will have all those capabilities, and sometimes it will be a mix of people. And then creating outreach events or discussion platforms where media-trained IPCC scientists could present the key headlines and stakeholders from different sectors and interest groups could respond, and we could circulate these explainer guides was very successful. And having the notion that audience members at the events could take away the explainers to spread in their networks offline and online was also really successful. So not thinking about the people in the room as being the ultimate end users of the information, but thinking of them as being communicators and influencers in their own right who would go on to spread the information, the good scientific information further. Next slide, please. A sort of summary of the engagement model, which I won't dwell on here because we're short of time, but you can find out more about it in CDKN's communications guide, is that we had at the heart of the exercise the strategic audience scoping and understanding audience needs and perspectives. Then we based part of the model on face-to-face engagements where we were handing out the knowledge products that we had designed and produced, and also backed by digital engagement, so that these would all mutually reinforce each other in a sort of virtuous circle. Next slide, please. So how did the audience use the materials? Well, we found that they used these explainer guides in briefing parliamentarians, in more informal discussions, or indeed more formal trainings within NGOs and civil society networks, just like this one, in fact. University lecturers and secondary school teachers use them directly for materials in educational settings. And as I mentioned, folks, not just the CDKN staff, but others use them to train and brief journalists. Next slide, please. The next step in our journey was to create regional tailored syntheses of the IPCC's fifth assessment report findings in 2014. And you can still find all of these online. What we had learned by this point was that we not only wanted to provide explainers, but we wanted to provide like photo banks. So free to use photographs that people could download from our website to illustrate the key themes and stories within the IPCC reports. So again, to this notion of sort of empowering our audience to be better communicators in their own right. And if you look on our AR5 toolkits pages, you also see that we're uploading the standalone colorful infographics and also PowerPoint packs that people could tailor and use for their own purposes, whether it was publishing a newspaper or a newsletter or giving their own presentation. Next slide, please. And really, by this point, we had learned not to make complicated graphics, but to do more and less complicated infographics, which would just tell a story at a glance. And this is one sort of showing at a glance that fisheries in small island states are very much impacted by climate change. That deep red around the fish shows that that sector is at very high risk, and the other sectors are at risk, but there's lower scientific confidence around that. Next slide, please. Then more recently, even in late 2019, early 2020, the IPCC issued its special reports on climate change and land and on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. And we did explainer guides to those as well, which you can find on the CDKN website. And these are part of the sixth assessment cycle of the IPCC. So these are more up to date, and I would encourage you to use these as much as you can if you're interested. And we got them translated into various languages. You can see the French and the Spanish examples there as well. And the next slide, please. And finally, to the ones that Alex mentioned, the sub-regional guides to Africa coming out of the sixth assessment report itself, which CDKN has worked with the University of Cape Town on. And you can find these in the resources section of our website. Next slide. I think, you know, what all of these experiences have shown us, and just to kind of recap quickly before I close on the key lessons about translating IPCC findings for regional or indeed sectoral audiences, I think we've managed to do it well and to pull it off when we've gotten IPCC authors to advise us to check our work. So if you're thinking of doing more of this kind of thing, I'd encourage you to do likewise. To simplify, but without compromising on the core scientific messages. If possible, learn from our mistakes, you know, and test visualizations and graphic ideas with focus groups, perhaps before you roll them out in a big way. Find and illustrate the human interest angles, you know, in the climate information. Make the human connection. That's what journalists are going to try and do with the information. They're always going to be looking for individuals or communities whose lives are being changed by climate change, or who are innovating solutions. And so think ahead a bit. What kind of photographs, what kind of case studies, what kind of spokespeople can you make available for the media or in your larger communications package to make that storytelling that much easier for others to do or to pick up on? And as you know, I said before, make messages in a way that they're highly shareable so that they can go viral in a way. Last slide, please. Integrate your communications outputs like fact sheets, reports, slides, etc., with a conversation about the implications of the science where you can. We like to say in CDKN, documentation with a conversation, please. And of course, the pandemic sort of took away our plans for a lot of the face-to-face outreach that we had hoped for in the most recent round of explainers. We have, it must be said, managed to do a lot via webinar, which has been a godsend. That has worked for certain audiences who have got a steady, reliable internet connection. Of course, it doesn't work for all. So now we're starting to do more face-to-face work again. And then the other thing I'd say is don't lose the big overarching messages of the IPCC in sub-regional or country detail. The way that the IPCC works, if you were, for example, I saw someone here was based in Dakar, Senegal. If you were looking for what's in the IPCC that's all about Senegal, you could do a keyword search for Senegal through all the chapters, and you'd be able to pluck out certain sentences or paragraphs, but they wouldn't give you the big picture story. The IPCC's strength is in synthesis. So keep going back to the chapter summaries, to the overall summaries about what are the big lessons and guidance that the scientists are giving, and then sort of contextualize the sub-regional or country examples within that. And also when you're translating, here's the sort of final lesson learned is in one way, you're translating scientific concepts into kind of simpler to understand concepts from a layperson's point of view, but you might also be translating from one language to another, as we were translating from our English master copy into Spanish and Portuguese and French. And it's really important those translators are scientifically trained and they are actually selecting the correct words as well. Otherwise, you could go awry. And then one more slide before I wrap up, just about how the IPCC's communications have evolved over the past 10 years. They've been paying a lot of attention to how they represent their key messages. They're way more tuned in now to regional presentation of findings. As Alex herself said, they have this wonderful interactive atlas online where you can select how different regions or countries will change, you know, under different climate, under different global warming scenarios. And also the Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability is continuing to have these regional chapters. And the IPCC Secretariat in Geneva and the technical support units for each of those working groups is putting out headline statements and videos, which makes our job as climate communicators a lot easier. Also, the Secretariat will be happy to put you in touch with speakers, IPCC authors, if you want them to speak at events, and they will pay for the travel of developing country speakers to your events if you want them to. You just need to contact them at media@ipcc.ch. That's it from me. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure, and I'll stick around for the questions and answers at the end.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was very, very interesting. And looking forward to hearing from you again in the Q&A period as well. So next up, we have Boris Orlowski, who is the program director for Tajikistan in Caritas Switzerland. And he's going to be presenting today on Caritas's climate corridor analysis. So without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to you. And we can start his presentation as well. Thank you.
Yes, please. Thanks a lot. Wow, yeah, it's always a bit tough to be the first German after two native speakers, especially if they are so eloquent. But I took one point from the last presentation very serious, and that was this tailor your communication to your audience, understand your audience. And this climate corridor approach that I will present now together with Oliver, the next speaker, targets specifically staff working at international NGOs, working on projects for which climate change matters. And that's also the meaning of the subtitle here, Climate Projections for Projects. Next slide, please. I would like to start with this quote. Forecasts are difficult, especially when they concern the future. I've tried to find out who actually is the author of this quote. I found several, among them Niels Bohr, the famous physicist. Next slide. And this difficulty is, of course, also relevant for future projections of climate. I'm sure most of you have seen this famous graph from the most recent IPCC report on future climate conditions. So yeah, Alex had already pointed out these different controls that affect our climate, among them our human behavior and the associated greenhouse gas emissions that go into the climate system that essentially determine how warm the future will be. And if you look here at this left panel, you see these many lines. Line presents a future trajectory of global warming according to one specific climate model and according to a different scenario about our human behavior over the coming decades, so to say. And you see there's a huge spread, especially towards the end of the century. And basically the upper half of the spread is according to the stronger greenhouse gas emission scenario, and the lower half is according to this greener scenario. However, if we look at a time horizon which is more relevant for typical development projects, say the next 10, 20 years, then you see that these two different scenarios don't matter that much. I mean, the line starts spreading into these two groups rather towards the end of the 21st century. And I find this something very important to keep in mind. I mean, this uncertainty exists. We do not really know how we will treat or mistreat our planet over the coming decades. But for the next 20, 30 years, this won't matter that much. Next slide, please. So what does this climate change mean for a specific project in a specific location? On top of the uncertainty that come from the future climate projections, we have a very complicated dependency between what happens on our project ground and the climate. And so, I mean, this climate corridor approach can be applied to many different applications, but certainly the most obvious and relevant application is for agriculture. And therefore, I've brought this graph here, which shows the temperature ranges that a typical cereal crop needs during its life cycle. Certain temperature range for sowing, then it needs cooler temperature for this vernalization stage, and so on. So it's really something that is very complex. And if you want to combine this with future climate projections, for example, to assess whether my crop that I grow currently will still be at ease under future climate conditions, it's a tricky question to answer. Next slide, please. Fortunately, there's a database from FAO which combines empirical knowledge about suitable temperature corridors, suitable precipitation corridors, under which, on average, an average crop thrives. It's not very specific. It doesn't account for any, I don't know, extreme events or whatever. But it's just the average climate conditions under which, from past experience, we know that a certain crop can grow, and this approach is at the base of the climate corridor approach as well. Next slide, please. So here I want to show examples from two varieties of maize that have been promoted within a Caritas project in Mali. And these thick black horizontal lines are now this climate corridor that has given the name to the approach. So basically, you see, it's nothing more than an interval of temperature. In this case, it's between 17 and 34 degrees. And we know that these maize varieties can grow if both the coldest and the warmest month of the growing period fall within this corridor. And now that you have this, all you need to do is use this corridor and combine it with the observed temperatures of the past centuries, and you can also add the future projections according to the data from the IPCC. And this is already it. So the red line here shows the temperatures of the warmest months. When you have a thick solid line, it's the observed temperatures of the past century. And then this band depicts the range of the global climate models as they project temperature increase for this very specific location of the project. And in blue, the corresponding thing for the coldest month. You see that the right and the left panel differ. This is because the varieties that are the base for the left panel have a growing period of 120 days. And so within 120 days, you have more space for a wider temperature range. For the right panel, the variety of maize has a much shorter duration period, so a bit more than 2 months. And that, of course, brings the coldest and the warmest temperatures during this period closer to each other. And what we can learn from this is that temperature will not be a problem over the coming decades. So for both varieties, the anticipated temperatures will remain within this corridor. Next slide, please. So this is now the corresponding analysis for precipitation. Again, we have a climate corridor, this time for precipitation. So this is basically the range in which the precipitation, the available precipitation must be for the crop to have enough water to live. And in the observations, so these are the thick solid lines in the left half of the two panels, you see that there's a huge network variability. There are certain years that are below the minimum requirement. Many of them are above. And I mean, this is in line with what you would expect for this region in Mali, that I mean, you can grow something, but the reserves in terms of water availability are definitely not huge. So if we now focus on the left panel and now on the future projection, so this is this blue grayish band in the right half of the panel, we see a clear decline of precipitation over the coming decades. And this thick blue line in the middle of the band, this is the median of all the analyzed climate models. So basically it says that half of the climate models project more water than this line, and the other half of the climate models project less water. And this line crosses the minimum threshold already more or less now. And yeah, I mean, this gives a clear indication that these maize varieties will not be possible to grow for much longer in this location. If we go to the right panel, where we see the same analysis for the variety which has a shorter period, then we see that the reserve is a bit more. So we can still grow this, yeah, at least until the half of the century. The trade-off, of course, is that this variety, as it grows much faster, has a much lower yield. So, I mean, this is often a measure of adaptation that is proposed. I mean, just go for another variety or another crop if you have less water. And it's true, you can find crops that can survive even with a reduced water availability as expected for the future. But a frequent trade-off is then that the yield is significantly lower. Next slide, please. This is just a complementary example, a similar analysis that we have done for wheat in Pakistan. And here it's very clear that temperature is the limiting factor. So yeah, the warmer months are already now very close to the upper limit and are projected to pass this upper limit very soon. Next slide, please. So yeah, basically to summarize, what you need to do such a climate corridor analysis, you need the climate corridors themselves. So these are these temperature ranges, these precipitation ranges. You can get them from FAO. Better still that you get them for the specific variety that is grown within your project. And you need the climate of today, or let's say the past decades. No, back please. And the climate of the future. And both of these are now easily accessible through the portals that Alex had in her presentation, and even more conveniently in a way that Oliver will present after my few slides. Next slide, please. So just a few experiences from applying these corridors in projects. I mean, it's clear that this analysis leaves out many further relevant constraints. It doesn't talk about soil. It doesn't talk about management. It doesn't include extreme events, etc. So, in itself, it will hardly allow for a thorough climate proofing of a crop at a specific location. However, I have found that this way of presenting climate change and its link to a very concrete and tangible activity is a representation of impacts of climate change that is understandable to our staff and to our beneficiaries. This is really fundamentally different from when you present a graph from the IPCC and tell them that everything gets warmer or drier or whatever, because it links climate change with something that they have a feeling for. And even if this representation isn't able to capture the entire system or the entire impact, it has often induced a fundamental shift in the discussion, in the discourse, to become more evidence-based. So if people realize that they need more information to assess whether their crop will be sustainable under future climate conditions, they get a first pointer where to look next. And for me personally, this is the greatest advantage of using this method, not so much of getting a quantitative or accurate estimation of when a certain crop doesn't work anymore, but because it changes the discussion of climate change. Thanks very much. Next slide. So in case you're interested, there's also a scientific paper on that has been developed with many colleagues from universities and NGOs. I'm happy to share a copy if you're interested. And now I'm done and hand over to Oliver. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Boris. Yes, thank you very much also just for giving us kind of a practical example of applying climate projections actually in climate change project planning as well. So we appreciate that. I think the audience also will appreciate the more tangible examples. So I'll also pass it on to Oliver now. Oliver Gardy, who is from the Bern University of Applied Sciences, who will be speaking about the climate data analysis tool. Yep, go ahead, Oliver.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everyone. I see we are a little bit short on time, so I will try to present my slides here as brief as possible. Yes, we work together with Caritas now on implementing this climate corridor approach that was just presented by Boris into a tool that is also easily accessible for projects to do such type of analysis. Now, Boris developed the method. We have now been developing a tool for that. But before going to this tool, I shortly also want to go again to this issue of uncertainties. Next slide, please. Uncertainties in climate projection. Oh, sorry, next slide again. Yes, as Boris, I will also start with a quote from a British statistician, George Box, who said, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that is the way how we have to use these climate models and climate projections. They help us to understand the climate system of the Earth, the different processes and how they interact. These climate models, they help us also to do some simulations into the future and to do some experiments, adding some greenhouse gases or reducing some greenhouse gases that we actually could not do because we just have one Earth. We cannot do experiments with our Earth. So we need these models, and they actually represent our current knowledge of the climate system, but they are not perfect. We have to accept that there are uncertainties, that there are errors also in these projections, but how to deal with that. Next slide, please. I don't know whether you know how these climate projections by the IPCC are actually done. So it's not just one model that is used, but it's about 30 to 40 different models that have been developed by different universities that are used to simulate those future possible climates under the assumption of those emission scenarios that we have already talked with. So here in this slide, it's a bit not so clearly visible, but you see the individual models now. These are the very thin lines, and then you see just the median of all those models. That is then the thick line. So somehow the average now. That is what usually said. This is probably the most probable projection, but actually each of those models they simulate a possible future climate trajectory, and you see this is very broad, and this is the uncertainty. You know, it is where do we actually go? What will be the climate in 2050? It's very uncertain, I would say. But to the next slide, please. We can try to decompose now this uncertainty. So variation from one year to the other, this is actually what we know in the climate system. This is just the natural variability. One year it's colder, the other one is hotter, one has more precipitation, the next year has less precipitation. This is what you see here in the orange. That is also what we observe when you look at the historic climate. We also see this up and downs. This is mainly due to this internal variability. So this is one uncertainty factor in the future. And the other one, we already heard, we do not know how much emissions humankind will emit in the coming decade. So these are these emission scenarios, of course, and Boris showed this already. This has a very high impact on climate projections, whether we now go to net zero with the emissions or whether we continue just business as usual. But this is mainly towards the end of the century. So this is long-term effect, no long-term uncertainty that comes mainly from these emission scenarios. And then we have this blue part here. That is where actually one model goes in one direction, the other model goes in the other direction, and that is somehow interpreted as, yet this is really the part of the climate system that we do not yet understand, and where models do not predict the same thing. So this is really the uncertainty that comes from our understanding of the climate system. And why I'm telling this, maybe next slide, is because this uncertainty, it depends on what we are looking at. If we just look at global average temperature, then it is quite clear. Mary showed it. When we double the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, we have to expect a warming of 3 degrees. This is this equilibrium climate sensitivity. That's quite clear, no? This global warming, this is a fact when we continue emitting greenhouse gas emissions. But the difficulty is then when we go to the local level, to the regional level, it becomes more uncertain. All the temperature projections at the regional level are less certain than just the projections on global average temperature. And then when we, for other climate variables such as precipitation, uncertainty again increases. And finally, what we are interested in as NGOs or with project practitioners is what do we have to expect? What are the local impacts? And there we have to accept that uncertainty is quite important. The more concrete, the more local we want to go with those projections. Next slide, please. So that as a general rule, temperature projections are more certain than projections about the precipitation, and global projections, so global average temperature or global average annual precipitation is much more certain than when we do some local projections. And about local projections, it again depends where are you? Is it in the Sahel? Is it in Southeast Asia? So this makes it a bit complicated, and that would be then also a question I have to Mary, how you deal with this uncertainty when you want to bridge this gap from global climate models to local climate impacts that have to be expected. Next slide, please. So how to deal with this? It's difficult. When we have consistent model projections, we have probably to assume that it will go in this direction and act accordingly. But where models lead to different results, one model says, yeah, precipitation will increase, the other one say it will decrease. So what do we do with that? Probably we have to think about it's possible that it goes in this way. We have to consider those changes in our project planning, in our thinking, and maybe the best strategy is to reduce vulnerability in general and increase resilience in whatever way this climate parameter will change. So climate models, they give us an indication in which direction it could go. They do not specify a route that is already clear and defined now. So now I come to our tool. Next slide, please. This Caritas CliMap. We can go to the next slide directly. So first we have similar, the app that is now available in a beta version and is just tested for Caritas projects. But if someone is interested, you can contact Caritas and you will probably also get access to this tool. So it allows us to define a specific project location by the coordinates and then download directly those IPCC model projections and also historical observed climate data and visualize this in this type of graphs that you clearly know. But in order to do that, you don't have to use this tool. For example, the World Bank Climate Knowledge Portal also allows you this type of visualizations for specific countries or regions. Next slide, please. So here, what we can do in the tool also is to look at how the seasonality of precipitation or temperature, how this evolved in the past, and also what do the climate models suggest how this might evolve in the future. So here in this case, for example, we have to expect that in spring, March, April, May, precipitation might decrease, while in the autumn months, August, September, October, November, precipitation might decrease in this region here in Siem Reap in Cambodia. That's what the models project. Next slide, please. But the reason why we developed this app actually is for implementing this climate corridor approach that Boris presented. So we have this in the tool, the default parameters coming from this EcoCrop database. They are readily available. You don't have to search them on your own. The climate data is readily available. And if you want, you can change this crop parameters. For example, if you know detailed climatic requirements for a specific variety, then you can modify here the temperature range or the precipitation range for this crop, or also the growing period, and produce this climate corridor graphs. Next slide, please. that is, for example, in Mali, the two varieties, maize varieties that Boris presented, so Tubaka and Cef, that more detailed information about those varieties, in particular for the growing period they need and the precipitation that has been obtained or is published in a local catalog of crop varieties. So if you have this information, the better. Next slide, please. We also implemented in the tool an alternative approach to judge or to analyze the climate suitability of specific crops. It's called this eco-crop index that has been developed some 20 years ago and is used in several scientific publications also, which is maybe not as illustrative as the climate corridor, because you don't see this corridor, you don't see this precipitation and temperature requirements of the different crops directly, but in principle it puts all this together in one index, no? And when this index is 1, that means no limitation, the crop grows perfectly. When this index is 0, it means this crop does not grow at all. What is nice with this eco-crop index, it can visualize other things. For example, it makes it simple, I think, to compare different crops, like here, these two maize varieties, Sotubaka and Cef, where we see that Sotubaka, we probably already had problems in the past. So in these dry years, in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, in the Sahel zone, it did not grow well, probably, this Sotubaka. But then there were years where it grew again quite well. So we had this high variability in the past, and we have also to expect in the future that this variability will continue, but that there will be years where it will still grow well, this Sotubaka, also in future. And on the other side, this Cef crop with the short growing period, but also with the lower yield, that practically had never problems in the past, and also in the future, this will be very probable a safe variety. And now, how to deal with this? So what we discussed also there in the Mali, that probably best would be kind of a risk spreading strategy, mixing both Sotubaka and Cef. So in dry years, having at least the Cef with the low yield, but in wet years, still benefiting from the high yield from the Sotubaka. So that for this type of analysis, I think this eco-crop index is very useful. And next slide. Because it's a simple index, we can also bring it to the map. So this is the project region around Kita in Mali, where Caritas is working on maize production. And here you see that this Sotubaka, it's particularly in the northern project zone, that it will be an issue or problematic to grow this crop in future, but not so much in the southern project region. Next slide. And then we have to be aware that both models, this climate corridor approach or this eco-crop index, they are very simplified representation of the water balance and the water requirements of the crop. There are other factors affecting this. In particularly, it's about soil, no? Also, how much water can be stored and kept in the soil, and we have other options as well when talking about agriculture than just changing the crop. We can improve soil management, we can try to reduce water runoff, we can discuss about whether irrigation can be a possibility, we can reduce the wind speed by planting hedgerows, cooling local climate by introducing agroforestry. So we should also keep that in mind. So those two approaches we just presented now, they are very simplified, but can help for sure in the analysis and in the discussion. Next slide. So I think this is wrong. The future is completely uncertain. There are a lot of uncertainties in the climate models, we told you, but still, I think we can learn a lot when we use this information correctly and we do an analysis of this, also taking into account and not forgetting about the uncertainty in making then our decisions based on those projections. Thank you. looking forward for the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Oliver. I think that's a very important key message, and one that we've all been touching upon a little bit too, which is that the time for action and planning is now, although it is very uncertain, as we know. So thank you for ending on that note. Now we've of course had some very interesting presentations now, and the next step will be the question and answer. I found them all very interesting, so although we did go a little bit over time, please feel free to ask any questions that you may now have for any of the speakers. But we also wanted to take this opportunity to kind of understand also what you or your organization might need in order to have some further support in utilizing climate projections for your projects, in particular what the Swiss NGO DRR platform could potentially provide. So even if you don't have a specific question for the speakers, but rather something that would be useful for you, feel free to share that in the chat. And I did just want to say thank you to all of the speakers as well, all for your inputs, whether it was on applications using IPCC knowledge, but also for applying climate projections in projects. I think it's very interesting also to learn about these techniques and the tools that are available, and it's very important for our audiences as well. So thank you very much. So at this time, please feel free to put any questions or comments into the chat. I haven't seen any so far. Perhaps our presentations were all too clear and didn't bring up any questions. But in any case, this is the topic of climate projections is one that's going to become increasingly more relevant as we try our best to figure out how to incorporate them for the different NGOs and using them for project planning. So I think that this is a topic that will continue to have plenty of discussion in the future. So even if there's not a question right now, I do anticipate that this is something that we'll be hearing about, and perhaps that you could reach out to me too to ask that, and I can share that with the Swiss NGO DRR platform to help with further discussion in the future. So, as seems that we do not have any questions at this time, I did want to give the opportunity to any of the speakers if you had any comments, any remarks or questions for the other speakers. We presented on some very different things, but I do think that it's all very relevant and interesting. And feel free.
I could respond to Oliver's question. Thank you. Thank you to all the other speakers, and you sort of put in a little footnote for me. I think you asked how I would respond to the lack of certainty in the climate models, and you postulated should one reduce vulnerability in general and increase resilience in general, and I strongly endorse that approach. Yes, I would have said exactly that, and I think actually a lot of the solutions per se lie in the sustainable development goals, which are not going to be necessarily easy to deliver given the climate related losses and damages, you know, which many communities around the world are experiencing even today. So to achieve and you know, larger disruptions to development as well, clearly, to achieve the SDGs by 2030 will be a big task. But if you just, well, I don't know, a kind of easy answer that some people give to your question, Oliver, is they say, oh, you take the no regrets or the low regrets, you know, investment options for adaptation, for example. And then you say, well, what do you mean? What is a no regrets or a low regrets option? So let me give a couple examples from the SDGs to illustrate what I mean. If you take the health SDG and you invest more in bringing up the in strengthening the general health of the population, then, you know, even if you're uncertain about whether your country or your region is going to endure more intense rainfall or more intense drought or heat wave or all of those things, if everyone's general health is better, then you imagine that in the face of those climate hazards and related impacts like the spread of vector-borne diseases, you know, people may be more resilient, more physically resilient if their overall health is better. So that would be one example. Another example would be gender equality. So even if there's uncertainty about what specific types of crops or livestock in an agricultural system are going to be the very most optimal, you know, for the climate in that region and in the next 20 to 30 years. If you're ensuring that your girls and young women get equal access to education and then information and, you know, land use and financial services, all of those different facets of gender equality, then in a way, I would call that a no regrets option, because no matter what the adaptations needed to be made in the agricultural sector, your women farmers of the future will be more resilient to take on the changes if they've been empowered in that way. So that's just a few examples for me.
Thank you, Mairi.
Yes, thank you so much. That was also great to have an opportunity to respond right away. Great. Does anyone else have any comments or questions that they'd like to add? Well, yeah, go ahead. No. Okay.
That's a good buzzword. This no regret. I mean, no regret is often also a compromise. You do something of which you know that it holds no matter what the conditions will be. And I think if one takes climate projections into account through the climate corridor approach or in another way, that can actually help you to go beyond the no regret in that you really exploit the space that climate gives you fully. But it's something that is a bit foreign to our NGO DNA. Thank you.
Indeed, I like that though, to go beyond no regret. So I think those are some good words to live by. All right.
Yeah, maybe it's mutual benefit, you know, for different facets of development and biodiversity and well-being. Yeah.
Great. Well, with that, we're almost out of time anyway. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to everyone who attended, and also for the wonderful speakers and all of your valuable presentations and inputs. It definitely gives us a better understanding of climate projections, how we can use them. And it was very great to hear all of your inputs. So thank you. I've also shared in the chat here just the resources page. Of course, the most recent one is the climate projections fact sheet. So if anyone is interested in learning more, they can check it out there, as well as all of the other wonderful resources that the platform has to offer. So on that note, thank you all very much and have a wonderful rest of your day.